Okay, thank you, Emily, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the Maritime Services Board images. As Emily mentioned, my name is Rhonda Campbell, and I'm coming to you from Kingswood, New South Wales, on the land of the Darug people. In the spirit of reconciliation, Museums of History New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. In this webinar, I will highlight images from the Maritime Services Board glass plate collection and the acetate negative collection, and how they document the work of the Sydney Harbour Trust and later the Maritime Services Board. They also provide a rich record of the construction of wharves, roads, and the adjoining facilities on Sydney Harbour and surrounds. The Sydney Harbour Trust, and later the Maritime Services Board, was responsible for the general improvement, preservation, and daily running of the Port of Sydney. It was also vested with the power to reclaim land for the erection of necessary infrastructure and to cleanse and modernise Sydney wharves. The images were primarily taken to document the work of the Sydney Harbour Trust / Maritime Services Board. They date from 1870 to 1960 and show Sydney Harbour as a working harbour and a centre for work and industry. They document the construction of wharves, roads, rail work and reclamation works, various types of ships and vessels, housing and building in the harbour area, including warehouses and boat sheds, and also views of Port Jackson. Over 4,000 of these images have been digitised and are now available to browse and download on our website. So this image that I have here is very much documents the work of the Trust or the Maritime Services Board. So this is showing the construction of wharfs number 7 to 10 at Piermont. So unfortunately, with a lot of these images, there is no date, but looking at that, you'd probably think it was around the 1940s or around the 1940s, 50s. Now, with the titles of the images, with the titling of the images, it's been taken from information written on the negative by the original photographer at the time the image was taken. In some cases, the photographer created a shot book listing all their images, the number, which was usually a 4-letter number, the reason why it was taken, the date, often just a month or just a year, and this was also used to get the title of these images. And you'll notice some of the images will have an additional title, and that's known as the alternate title. So in 2006, a maritime services historian generously provided many hours to help identify these images. So this has greatly enriched our knowledge of these images, and you'll see this as we look through the images today. Now, the Sydney Harbour Trust came into operation in 1901. The Trust consisted of 3 commissioners appointed by the Governor to be generally responsible for the improvement and preservation of the Port of Sydney. All foreshores, lighthouses and tugs within Sydney Harbour, which belong to the government, were vested in the Trust. So the Trust operated between 1901 until 1936, when it was replaced by the Maritime Services Board. So this lovely image that we have here shows the Sydney Harbour Trust steam launch Lady Hopetoun at the Commissioner's Steps near the newly built Sydney Harbour Trust. Now, originally this image wasn't dated, but additional information provided to us has got this image dated as 1904. Now, the Lady Hopetoun was designed by a renowned local naval architect, Walter Reeks, and it was built by Watty Ford in North Sydney at a cost of £4,500. She was launched in 1902 and entered service as the Vice Regal steamer for the Sydney Harbour Trust, and she was a well-known sight on the harbour and remained in service until well into the 1960s. When the Lady Hopetoun retired, a service group of enthusiasts negotiated to take over the craft, and she became the founding vessel of the Sydney Maritime Museum, where she is continually lovingly maintained by volunteers from the Sydney Maritime Museum. Behind the Lady Hopetoun, you can see the Sydney Harbour Trust building, and that dome spire there is of Metropolitan Fire Station number 3. Unfortunately, both of these buildings were in the direct path of Circular Quay railway station and were demolished between 1953 and 1956. So it's very fortunate that we have this image so we can see what those wonderful buildings did look like. So as I mentioned, the Sydney Harbour Trust was dissolved when the Maritime Services Board was established in 1936. The new board combined the functions of the Navigation Department and the Sydney Harbour Trust. The Sydney Harbour Trust was eventually dissolved in 1995 under the Ports Corporatisation and Waterways Management Act. This image we have here is of the Maritime Services Board pilot steamer Captain Cook. The maritime historian who kindly added to the descriptions of our images described the Captain Cook as possibly the most beautiful ship ever built to work on Port Jackson. The steamer was a regular sight on Sydney Harbour in the 1940s and 50s as a pilot ship working out of Watson's Bay. It was built in 1938 at Mort's Dock for the Maritime Services Board, and she was replaced in 1959 after 21 years of continuous service at Watson's Bay. Now, a pilot boat was used by the Maritime Services Board to transport pilots between land and the inbound or outbound ships that they were piloting. So marine pilots typically had extensive seafaring experience, and their job was to manoeuvre ships through dangerous or congested waterways such as Sydney Harbour. Now, there were a number of events or reasons for the redevelopment of the harbourside and wharves. The New South Wales government resumed harbourside real estate to commence a large-scale redevelopment project following the bubonic plague in 1900. The Sydney Harbour Trust, after establishment in 1901, began a program of improvements around the harbourside, and of course, the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge changed the appearance of the Rocks Circular Quay and North Sydney. Also, in 1937, a commission for the renewal of Circular Quay, headed by Sir John Butters, handed down its findings in what was generally known as the Butters Plan for the redevelopment in and around Sydney Cove. This included the construction of the Circular Quay railway station, an elevated road and railway, and the construction of new offices for the Maritime Services Board and the rebuilding of the ferry wharves. So both of these images here show wharf reconstruction and cleansing following the bubonic plague. So the one on the left is a waterfront construction site, and we have an alternate title just below that. It's been identified as the Walsh Bay area post plague reconstruction, and you can see there are some horse and drays there in the foreground. The image on the right is rat proofing at Miller's Point. Of no date on this image, but we would have to assume that it is post 1900 after the plague. Now, the Butters Plan required the demolition of some of Sydney's earliest surviving public buildings, including the convict-built commissariat stores. At the time, this did spark a lot of debate in newspapers. However, the plan went ahead and the demolition of the commissariat commenced on the 5th of July 1939 to make way for the Maritime Services Board new headquarters. Fortunately, we have these two beautiful images showing the commissariat here. Both of these images were taken on the same day, the 2nd of February 1939. The one on the left shows the commissariat with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia in the foreground, and this was taken at the intersection of George and Barton Street. And the one on the right is showing Circular Quay West when it was still a traffic thoroughfare. Again, we can see the Sydney Harbour Bridge in the background. So this is an example where a title was probably taken off the image or the shot book, but then below that additional information has been provided, and we've got the alternative title providing a little bit more information about that particular image, including the naming the vessels that are docked there at Circular Quay. So quite fortunate still to have these wonderful photos of the commissariat. So this is now the Maritime Services Board building. So it was designed between 1939 and 1940 by the Maritime Services Board architect, Henry William Withers. So during the demolition of the commissariat stores, Australia was plunged into World War II, and the site remained vacant for many years as construction slowed to a halt. Work recommenced at the end of the war in 1946, and the offices were finally completed in 1953. So the MSB operated at this site until the late 1980s, And of course, in 1990, it became the building as we know it today, the Museum of Contemporary Art. So the shot we have here is of that building being constructed. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia is still in the foreground there. And of course, this again is taken on the corner of Barton and George Street. So I've just put a little map below that. So just to show you where Barton Street was. And on this little map, it's also got the annotation that Circular Quay Railway Station is under construction. So Barton Street, I would imagine today, is what we know as First Fleet Park. And then, of course, the image on the right is what we know that area to look like today. Now, as mentioned, a major part of the Sydney Harbour Trust program of improvements was the construction and improvement of wharves. This image on the left is a very early image of Cowper Wharf Road looking north towards Potts Point. Again, unfortunately, this image has no date. For the expansion of the wharves at Woolloomooloo, the mangrove swamps were originally drained in 1850 and a new semicircular wharf was constructed in 1866. The map just down the bottom there shows you what that semicircular wharf at Woolloomooloo Bay would look like. In 1899, initially Cowper Wharf was used by small coastal shippers, particularly timber traders. The adjoining land became dotted with sawmills and timber yards and small-time boat building. By 1899, Cowper Street Wharf was accommodating ocean-going vessels, both steam and sailing. And up until 1901, the wharves, with few exceptions, were practically in private hands and constructed to meet the requirements only of the individual owners. When the Sydney Harbour Trust was established, they began to resume privately run properties all around Sydney's waterfront and build modern facilities. So between 1911 and 1915, the Trust built the Finger Wharf that bisected the circular shore wharf at Woolloomooloo. So the image that we see on the right here is workmen laying the deck for the Woolloomooloo Finger Wharf. It was wharf number 6 in Woolloomooloo, and this was taken in 1912. And this is what we know development all around it when it's facing north from the previous image that we saw there. Another key element in the program of improvements was the creation of a new road that followed the shoreline, linking Circular Quay to Walsh Bay and Darling Harbour. This would be the new freight thoroughfare around the headland. Hickson Road was named in honour of Robert Hickson, the first president of the Sydney Harbour Trust in 1901. Prior to the creation of Hickson Road, access to each wharf area via the roads leading down from top of the ridge, which made the transportation of goods from one area to another extremely difficult. So from 1928 to 1932, this area was a major construction zone for the southern approach for the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And then in 1933, Hickson Road was repaved for motor traffics. Now, these two images are dated 20 years apart. The one on the left was taken in 1928, and it's showing Hickson Road facing south. So you can see that it's very much horse and cart traffic there. And then looking to the right, this image is dated 1949 and very much a commercial scenes. Burns Phillip Wharf number 7 is seen in this image as well. And of course, we have the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So it's wonderful that we have these images to show you that 20-year difference of how Hickson Road looked. Although you can see a motor vehicle just squeezed in there on the side on that 1928 image there. So Walsh Bay itself was first named in a Sydney Harbour Trust drawing in 1918, showing the intended development. So we can see with the comparison of that map in 1918 and what it looks like today, it very much looks like what the Sydney Harbour Trust originally designed in 1918. And below we have the very modern pictures of what Hickson Road looks like today, and it is definitely all motorised traffic on Hickson Road today. Another development was the creation of a new road, and that was Pottinger Street. This area was originally steep cliffs leading to a narrow rocky foreshore, and wharf development began in this area in the 1880s to take advantage of the deep water below the cliffs. So I've just got a map to the right there that shows you where Pottinger Street was, and that was to link Windmill Street to Hickson Road. So it was originally started in 1914 to provide an access with an easy gradient between Hickson Road and Windmill Street. So by 1916, excavation had finished and 24,000 cubic yards of sandstone was removed, and many of the houses' backyards had to be reconstructed. So you can see on the image there on the left, the terrace houses on the top of what would have been that steep cliff there. So again, due to World War I and post-war concrete shortages, the last work wasn't completed on the viaduct connecting Pottinger Street to the wharves until 1920. Again, this is what it looks like today. There is actually still, I believe, a slight resemblance. You've still got the terrace houses there in that bottom image there, and also you still have that, what would have been that steep cliff there. Now moving down the harbour to Circular Quay. So Circular Quay was originally built between 1837 and 1855 and was originally known as Semicircular Quay because of the shape of the stoneworks built with convict labour to stabilise the new shoreline reclaimed from mud flaps. The quay was constructed in phases from 1830 until the 1860s to allow for commercial shipping to berth alongside wharves and warehouses that once dominated all three sides. From the late 1890s and after the formation of the Sydney Harbour Trust in 1901, ferry commuter wharves came to dominate. And from this time, Circular Quay grew as a commuting hub with both ferries and trams terminating at the site. So this image that we're looking at here is taken in 1936. We can see two Manly ferries docked there and, of course, some trams operating in the foreground. So the ferries are, on the right, we have the Bellabera, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which was first launched in 1910 and made its last run to Manly in 1973. Then on the left, we have the Barragoola, which entered service in 1922 and retired in January of 1983. So it's a wonderful image that we have of Circular Quay there, but this one of Circular Quay is a particular favourite of mine. And this was taken roughly 12 years before the previous image. This was taken in March of 1924, and it's showing Circular Quay as the hive of activity as we still know it today, and maybe this was taken through at morning rush hour. We can see the trams operating there, and of course we know that the first tram started in 1861, and then 100 years later in 1961, the last tram made its final journey from Circular Quay. In the 1940s, the trams were phased out and replaced by buses, but of course we know today we have the light rail operating down there. So this is actually a particularly great photo. You can see the signs of the buildings, all the activity that would have been occurring around Circular Quay in the 1920s. So from 1936, though, the appearance of Circular Quay was dramatically changed with the construction of the railway viaduct. And as with many projects during this time, work was delayed by World War II. Work recommenced in 1945 and the viaduct was finally completed in 1954. This image doesn't have a date, but it would have been in the middle of when that viaduct construction was taking place. So this is again documenting the work that was occurring around Circular Quay at this particular time. Before the harbour, another major change to the landscape of Circular Quay was the construction of the overseas passenger terminal. So with post-war immigration and tourism and the growth and development of larger passenger ships meant the construction of a dedicated cruise and ocean liner terminal became a necessity. Waterfront running parallel to the historic Rocks warehouses was reclaimed for a new passenger terminal. Groundbreaking for the terminal began in 1856, construction began in 1858, and was completed quite quickly, I think, in 1960 at a reported final cost of $1.7 million. Quite a lot of money, even in 1960. 10 days after its official opening, the passenger terminal was host to its first passenger ship, the SS Oriana, which had arrived on its maiden voyage from England carrying 2,000 passengers. So this image is showing construction of the passenger terminal. And if you just look in the background there, you can see that Fly TAA sign, which is a blast from the past, but I myself can remember flying on TAA airlines. And that's another great thing about these photos. As with our previous image of Circular Quay, all the wonderful names on the old buildings and the wonderful old signs that we can see on those. And of course, this is how we know the beautiful Circular Quay today. Before the Harbour Bridge was built, and many bridges, ferries were needed to commute across the harbour. So the Sydney Harbour Trust and later the Maritime Services Board were also responsible for the many suburban wharves, such as Manly Wharf. So the first Manly Wharf was constructed in 1856 at the very same site as the present Manly Wharf. The image we have on the left is from 1934, I beg your pardon. And the image on the right is from 1940. So in 1939, a fire broke out in a milk bar on the main wharf and spread throughout the structure, causing £10,000 worth of damage, leading to that wharf having to be rebuilt. In 1940, the Maritime Services Board engaged a young, gifted modernist architect named Arthur Baldwinson, not long after his return from several years working in England, to design major reconstruction of the ferry wharves at Manly and Circular Quay. The clean lines of the cream-painted timber-clad structure was described as being appropriately modern and maritime at the time. The basic form remains in these two wharves today. And of course, Manly Wharf was added to the New South Wales State Heritage Register in 2000. So these are some wonderful, lovely, I guess, before and after shots of what Manly Wharf looked like. And of course, this is what the lovely Manly Wharf looks like today. We also hold this lovely early image of Musgrave Wharf at Mosman, and this image is dated around 1900. And you can see there it was a rocky road down to the wharf there. So Musgrave Street was renamed Mosman South in the 1990s, and today it's known as South Mosman and continues to serve the people of Mosman as an active ferry wharf, and it's owned by Transport for New South Wales. And of course, on the right, that's what the wharf looks like today. As well as building the wharves, works also had to be undertaken by the Sydney Harbour Trust and Maritime Services Board to maintain the wharves. The Sydney Harbour Trust Commissioners worked with the Australian Museum, the Public Works Department, the Department of Agriculture and the Queensland Forest Service to develop new methods to address the deterioration and preservation of timber wharf structures. And by the mid-1930s, a comprehensive program for treating the piles of jetties in Walsh Bay had begun. So the image on the left there is a workman spraying the wharf. This is probably with an anti-rot or an anti-pest treatment. And that little punt that he is in there was known as a paint punt. And this image was taken in 1936. The Trust and the Board also sought to use modern machinery efficiently and effectively as it cleansed and rebuilt the Sydney wharves. The moves from a timber wharf to those constructed of concrete was also about the ability of concrete to last longer and to avoid some of the problems timber wharves faced from immersion in seawater. So the image on the right here is workers, possibly with a static cement mixer, doing some of that work constructing the new wharves, and this image is dated 1927. Another role undertaken by the Trust and the Board was to ensure the safety of the navigation in Sydney Harbour. So this wasn't restricted to safety signs and buoys, but it also included keeping the waterways clear of wrecks and derelicts and abandoned vessels. While the Trust had this power from the inception, the 1930 Sydney Harbour Trust Amendment Act enabled the Trust to remove derelicts and wrecks, but also to recoup the cost from the owners of this vessel. So this image shows a group of workmen, and it looks like to be a vessel that's covered with barnacles. It's been retrieved from under the water. So that is part of the work that the Trust and the Harbour and the Maritime Services Board also carried out, removing wrecks from the harbour as well to keep the waterways safe. Outside of all the wharf repair and construction, the Sydney Harbour Trust also built a playground. We have this lovely image of children in a playground constructed by the Sydney Harbour Trust at Millers Point. And we can also see Sydney Harbour Trust staff houses in the background, and this image is dated 1922. The Lance Playground was constructed in 1912 by the Sydney Harbour Trust to provide recreational space for Millers Point residents. It was stated, if the children of our tenants cannot have gardens or yards for their play, then assuredly we must give them a playground. It was opened by Lady Chelmsford, wife of the Governor, in 1912, and it was described as the first public playground in the city. In 1916, at the behest of the Trust, the playground was taken over by the Kindergarten Union, who still manages the kindergarten today. The City of Sydney purchased the kindergarten from the Maritime Services Board in 1991. And of course, that is what it looks like today, but it's wonderful to think that after all these years, that space is still a playground for the children to enjoy. Now, as I mentioned, a number of the images haven't been identified. They don't have a date. So as an example, we have an image here. All we know, it's an image of sea and from an unidentified shore. On the right, we have a street scene at the rocks. No street has been identified, and no date has been put on that. Then we have an unidentified building, and then we have an unidentified ship at an unidentified wharf. So a lot of unidentified. So we would really love it if you have any ideas about what any of these unidentified images are, to contact us through our Ask an Archivist service on our website. And we always love to identify these images, and we always appreciate any information that can be provided about these images, even if it's just a date. Anything to help identify these images is greatly appreciated. So now, how would you find these images on our website? Well, you would go to our homepage, Museums of History New South Wales, and then you have the Search the State Archives. You would hit that, which would take you to our State Archives Collection search page. Now, I mentioned if you have any information about these images, you can contact us through Ask an Archivist, and that's where you would find that as well. So in the search box, the easiest way to find this would be to add the series number, which is NRS 9856. Now, this will take you to all of the images that have been identified. So as you can see there, if you look to the left, there are 4,536 of these images available on our website to look at. If you wanted to look at a particular image, you would click on the image there. That would take you to another page with a little bit more detail. Then on the image gallery thumbnail, click on that, takes you to a larger version of that image. Now in the top right-hand corner, there are some commands where you can make it full screen, or you can use the magnifying glass to increase it on this particular page. Now, this image again is of West Circular Quay with the construction of the Maritime Services Board building. We can see there that the commissariat, sadly, has been demolished. The Commonwealth Bank is still surviving in the front there. And of course, we have all those wonderful buildings in the background there of the rocks, and the temporary sort of construction board that we see today on construction sites, covered in all those wonderful old signs again. So that actually, this is a very nice image as well. If you wanted to search for something specific and you didn't have time to wade your way through the 4,500 images, you can refine your search by entering a search term. So again, you would enter the series number NRS 9856, and if you wanted to look at images of the construction of the Finger Wharf, you would add that term, and then that would just display these search results for images which have Finger Wharf in their title there. Now, just something to note, we are still in the process of digitising the remaining acetate negatives from the Maritime Services Board collection. There are still over 30,000 images to be digitised and uploaded onto our website. So this will happen sometime in the future, so it's just a matter of watching this space. Well, I can see we're almost out of time, so this brings me to the end of the presentation. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed looking at just a very small selection of the images that are available in the Maritime Services Board image collection.